Good evening and welcome to another Hot Topic where we discuss the issues of the day in East Yorkshire and Northern Lincolnshire. In tonight's programme we look at social housing, cuts to benefits and homelessness issues in our region. Is there enough being done to help the homeless? To discuss this, I'm joined by my guests, Tony Bramley, Chief Executive of Shoreline Housing Partnership since 2004. He's worked within the housing sector since 1978 and is a Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Housing, among other things. Shoreline offer affordable housing, owning and managing nearly 8,000 properties in North East Lincolnshire. And I'm also joined by Louise Crammond, roofless intervention worker and outreach team member for the Hull-based homeless service Hull HARP, that is Homeless and Roofless Project. The charity celebrated its 30th anniversary in 2012. Welcome to Hot Topic. I'm Hugh Richards. Before we start the debate, we took to the streets of Grimsby to get your views on the issue of homelessness.
The homelessness caused by the councils. They're giving too much money to so-called refugees and overseas, where they could be putting more into our country and our towns to make life better for our own people.
By doing all the empty properties up and letting the homeless move into them instead of just leaving them derelict.
As far as looking after people with homeless, trying to avoid them becoming homeless in the first place is really serious key. So it's looking after their needs, making sure that they have accommodation, making sure they have access to accommodation, social housing, whatever it is. That's the start. And then the other was the relief if they are homeless, how you look after them.
Homelessness, it's a massive issue and difficult.
Louise, can I start with you? I know it's difficult to make these estimates, but how many people do you think there are homeless in, well, let's say in Hull?
In Hull, at the moment, we've just actually submitted the figures for the rough sleeper estimate. So I can't give you those figures right now, but what I can tell you, it is increasing year on year. From 2009 to 2011, we had a 200% increase of rough sleepers, not of homeless. It's a different category. So
well, if you could put it, that's a 200%, that sounds absolutely awful, but if you can put a real figure, is that 200% of 5 or 200% of 500?
It started off a figure of 9 and
Just
rose
9?
to 15. And then it rose to 22 over that period. So although there's been an increase of 200% of rough sleepers, we're not talking huge figures, but these are people that are actually sleeping on the streets that night. These are the people that you find in the doorway in the morning. The homeless figures are much greater than that, but they can include people that are sofa surfing. So you've got the hidden homeless, you've got people that are risk of eviction or being evicted. They're actually becoming homeless. Where Hull HARP works is actually with that rough sleeper population of Hull and the East Riding.
It's horrible to be homeless, of course, but I'm sort of slightly surprised that it's fewer than 30 in a city the size of Hull. 30 is too many, of course, but that's quite a low number.
The issue you have with a rough sleeper count, which has changed this year, previously when we counted them, we actually had one day in which to count them. We had to find them bedded down, so that meant they were actually asleep or in their bedding or stood by it, otherwise we couldn't count them as a rough sleeper. This year has changed with it being an estimate. So what we're trying to do is all the people that we're working with, we're verifying over a period of time that they're actually rough sleeping, and then we'll bring those figures in. But even then, it's still a large amount of people that are actually sleeping rough, that are vulnerable on the streets.
Tony, you're in the business of providing housing for these people. You're the solution to this problem, as it were. Why is anybody homeless in a country which has an enormous welfare state, an enormous way of providing a safety net for people in an expensive way that everybody's paying for very highly? Why are the people sleeping on the streets?
Chance and circumstance. It's incredibly easy. If it could happen to us tomorrow. You could have an accident, something could happen in a personal relationship, you could lose your job, you could get very ill. There's all sorts of reasons why people find themselves unable to maintain a tenancy or maintain their home. And Louise's point, I mean, the rough sleeping is the tip of the homelessness iceberg. What sits under that is the hundreds of people, the tens more people than actually out on the street who haven't got a secure place to live, or the people who live in a place which they're in fear of living in because they're vulnerable, they may have a domestic abuse issue with a partner, or they may be living in a very difficult circumstance with a landlord who's harassing them, and they don't really want to be there at all. So whilst the rough sleeping part, the street sleeping part is the very visible part of it, it's the hundreds of people who actually apparently have a roof over their head, but actually in an incredibly vulnerable situation. And they're the people we tend to see more day to day.
But in that vulnerability, I mean, it's the financial vulnerability that's the one that's most dangerous there, I guess. That if you lose your job, if you have an accident, for some reason you suddenly have no income, there's still always the housing benefit there. There's still always the state will provide you with rent.
But one shouldn't underestimate the incredible disruption to a household. Imagine you have a health problem, you have children, you have caring responsibilities. It's about money, yes, but it's about emotional and financial stability. It's about having things around you. It's about having those networks. Can I get my kids to school? Can I get to a hospital? Can I see my relatives who are elderly and need care? So the damage which comes with homelessness, yes, the whole story is about the house and the bricks and mortar, but it's actually about that security that it gives to people. And I think you often find that whilst we can provide people with a home, we can't provide them with all those other supports which are obviously necessary. And housing benefit, therefore, is a very important part of the solution, but it's not the only part.
Well, that's the fact. I suppose it gets to a matter of definitions, Louise, that you've made the distinction between street sleepers and homelessness. But there's a point where, I mean, we have, for instance, 35-year-olds still living with their parents. Would that count as homelessness?
No, that certainly wouldn't count as homeless. Because they're housed.
But it might be insecure housing. No, I mean, my parents love me very much, but I don't think they want me living there.
Well, one of the biggest causes of homelessness is the breakdown in relationships, and that can be anyone within a family. It might be a younger person. Younger people are more at risk of being homeless than any other age group. But it could be, like you say now, you've got a 35-year-old living with the parents. That's
not a perfect situation. I mean,
it's not. It's got to be managed, but they are not someone I would work with. They are not homeless. However, their situation may make them vulnerable, and it may be, like you said, it's yourself that's actually dealing with that person. But as they're not actually classed as homeless, they have no eligibility for local authority housing neither, because they're not necessarily deemed at risk, because they're not vulnerable.
I think that's the point. There's a whole raft of people now, and it is about economic pressures, about the ability to buy and to rent, because as prices have risen across the country, who find themselves effectively trapped at home, but on perhaps not bad incomes, to be honest about it, but they still can't get into the property ladder in the particular area that they live because the demand is so high.
Well, we'll move on to the prices and the property ladder. I just want to talk about these benefits first. The government has been providing a homeless prevention grant of about £160 million a year. There's talk that has been going to local councils and organisations. It's helped about 1 million people since 2010. And in North East Lincolnshire, anyway, it's been helping things like the no second night out.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So that nobody should ever be on the streets 2 nights in a row, as it were. And the East Coast Homeless Street Kitchen and Homeless UK on Pastor Street. How important is that grant? And with your political antennae, Tony, maybe you first, is that going to last?
Well, who knows? I mean, we'll probably find out more next week with the comprehensive spending review announcement. I mean, the homelessness prevention grant has been used very, very well in North East Lincolnshire, and I guess across the country as a whole. And there has to be a concern when that funding isn't there, that you will have people tipping into the homelessness route who are currently being prevented. And it's these usual cases that you can save money in one part of the system and cost appears in another part, because without homeless prevention and grant, if it is cut back, perhaps not being there, we might find the consequences of that later down the line when somebody does turn up as homeless and vulnerable and has demands on health service, mental health services, housing services and so on and so forth. So prevention, as they say, it's cliche, is better than cure. Far better to do it that way than to then sweep up afterwards.
And you have your own worries, Louise, about these benefit cuts and changes to the way that payments are going to be made.
I'm certainly very concerned about when universal credit comes in. What's going to happen is people are moving from a fortnightly payment and payments that are made directly to the landlords for rent to actually that coming to them in one lump sum. So you could have someone that's coming from picking up of benefits of employment support allowance of maybe £140 a fortnight. All of a sudden they're going to get a lump sum which could be as much as £600, £700, £800. And then they've got to then take on the responsibility to make the payments out of that.
So you don't think the beneficiaries should be you don't think they're responsible, as it were? You don't think they can be trusted not to lend the money on?
Yes, there are people that will do that, but what you're not taking into account are the stress and pressure. What if somebody is ill and for a week they get statutory sick pay? You know, how are they going to manage all of these things? It just takes one small thing to tip the balance, and you put in more stress on somebody in terms of benefits and them trying to manage the payments on top of everything else that's in their lives.
Louise, Tony, we'll have to stop there. Join me after the break when we'll continue this discussion.
I think sometimes homelessness gets mixed up with begging, because I've seen people on the streets begging, saying they're homeless when they've actually got houses or flats of their own. So it's hard to tell which is which.
Well, I think it's terrible, homelessness. I think I really feel sorry for the people who are homeless, and I think a lot of the situations are caused by unemployment and drugs.
It's a shame, really, in this world of plenty. It is. You're either in the haves or the have-nots. And I'm in the have-not, by the way.
Welcome back. Still with me in the studio, my guests, Tony Bramley, Chief Executive of Shoreline, and Louisa Crammond from Hull Harp. Louisa, sorry, I had to stop there. We were talking about the benefits and the fact that the new benefit system is going to pay it all in one great big lump sum.
Yeah.
How much is the bill for housing people, the taxpayers' bill, as it were? Was that a bit more of an accountant's question?
It certainly is. That's not something. I mean, what I can talk about is things like the allowance, the housing for benefit for a single person is £69 per week. When they actually go to find even social housing, if it's available, the actual top-up that they have to pay, there's very little you can find for £69 per week. It's often a bed sit. So we end up with people in a trap. How do they move out of it? How do they move on from actually being someone on benefits in a bed sit to someone that could be working and actually moving on to a mortgage? People are very much trapped by the benefits at the moment, and trying to help them and move on and to take them off the streets, to get them into accommodation is extremely hard. Where do you find rent in advance? Where do you find a bond? You know, there's lots of things, there's lots of steps to move forward, and this is where we come to social housing.
Perhaps that's the social housing. You are also in a slightly dodgy financial position, just in the first aspect of that, in that the government has insisted on your reducing your rents.
Yes, which will obviously be an advantage to tenants who are renting from us, because they'll see real terms rent increase. But I think the difficulty for us is that it was a completely unexpected move in the budget in July, and it's caught us completely by surprise. It's going to extract, in our case, about £4 million worth of revenue each year, and we're having to translate that saving back into service reductions. So the challenge it's faced us is how do we maintain the level of service when our income's going to be dropping by such a...
What services are you cutting?
Well, quite a range. The way we would give it as an analogy is that we've been around for about 10 years since we spun out of the council in 2004, and we'll be winding our services back more or less to the position they were in 2004. So most of the enhancements that we've built on, which have been around tenancy support, older person support, what we call crime prevention, which is dealing with antisocial behaviour, those sorts of aspects of the service we fear will have to wind back and end, and we'll be back to doing basic landlord services without any of the additional benefits.
Crime prevention, we're already paying for an organisation to prevent crime called the police force. That's not part of your job in the first place, is it?
It's not part of our job, but it's about quality of life out on the estates, and the police can do so much. There's a lot of talk about can the police fill the gap. Well, there's a responsibility on other agencies and indeed the population, the community as a whole. So we try and assist our own population, our tenants, to manage their situations in terms of safety and security, and we do that by providing extra staff who deal with that antisocial behaviour. The sort of stuff which the police would consider to be quite minor or negligible in a way, if you're living next door to that person who's causing that problem, can be an enormous problem for you and can become a big problem for us, and we think it's money well spent.
I want to just move on to the sort of the big macroeconomic picture here. The reason that there are some people who are finding it either homeless and in extreme street sleeping is because there simply aren't enough places for people to live. There are either too many people or too few houses, one way or another.
Too few houses.
There's a ratio.
Yeah.
Is Shoreline building?
We're building a very small number ourselves. We're actually acquiring, we buy houses. We aim to buy around about 50 or so houses a year. In actual fact, we're finding that very difficult to deliver in the current housing market. At that rate, we'll never meet the demand that we've got, but that's about as much as we can afford. I think the government's committed to a figure of producing an additional 1 million new homes by 2020. It's a very ambitious target. We've not built at that rate for a very long time, and we're reaping the legacy of 30 years of government policy. The homes haven't been built, costs are rising, people are not able to get into housing, and that's the circle we're in, the vicious circle.
Well, this isn't, I'm not suggesting that this is Shoreline's responsibility, but North East Lincolnshire needs, in order to support its population of housing, it needs to build about 237 new houses a year, but it's only building 170. What's stopping the growth of the other?
Well, it's a mixture. It's partly market factors. I mean, it's partly market factors. Is the demand there in cash terms to draw a developer in and build on a speculative basis? It's partly about planning regulations and whether or not there's sufficient flexibility to develop. And so anywhere like North East Lincolnshire, like Hull, where the markets for housing are a bit mixed, some areas very viable, some less so, you're going to find difficulty in making that provision.
Well, it's that regulation. I mean, because I'm asking because just last week, the idea of developing 400 new homes at Tolbar, the council, North East Lincolnshire Council, deferred that decision. It strikes me that if you're going to build 400 new homes and that it's commercially viable, somebody wants to do it, what could possibly be stopping them?
Well, local opinion, local politics. It's all very well saying we'll have 1 million new homes in the country, but they've got to go somewhere. And I have to say it is the case. Many communities are very welcoming of new homes. Some communities are less so. It's often concerns about pressures on schools and GP surgeries and road networks and so on and so forth. And therefore it's fine until the 400 are next to you. And therefore, obviously, the duty of the local authorities to try and balance those different wishes of people against
NIMBYism.
It's not as simple as just building 400 houses. There is the infrastructure. You can't just, we have a lot of this issue in the East Riding with the villages expanding, that there isn't the infrastructure there. There isn't the GP, there isn't the shops. You can't just say it's as simple as building these houses. They've got to be in the right place. They've got to have the right infrastructure, and they've got to be affordable. That's a crucial thing.
Well, but that becomes a terribly negative argument, doesn't it? Let's say that infrastructure is seats in school places. You don't say we can't build these homeless people a house because we don't have a place for little Jimmy's geography class. That's not a good enough reason to leave them sofa surfing, for instance.
No, I agree, but it's all about coming together and it being appropriate and in the right place. You're not going to have a community welcoming 400 houses if it's put in the wrong place. It should be working with the community to bring it into the right place, to get the right people into the right housing as well.
How many houses, I gave that number for North East Lincolnshire, do you know how many houses a year Hull needs to build in order to house its population?
It's slightly higher than the North East Lincolnshire one, but it is about that, give or take 2030.
About 250, something like that.
It is, but again...
It's surprising considering how much bigger Hull is than Grimsby, that it's a much lower ratio.
The issue we've got in Hull is that actually the boundaries of Hull restrict the growth because it's actually quite a small city, and then out of that you go into the East Riding, and they very recently asked the East Riding if they'd be willing to let Hull extend their boundaries and take some of the East Riding area, and it was a very resounding no.
Yes, Hull's search for Lebensraum, it didn't go down very well in the East Riding, did it?
Not at all, no.
Just to go with these economics, Tony, I mean, it's just supply and demand. We need more houses, the lower the price will be, and the more affordable they'll be.
Yep.
Grimsby prices went up by about 10% this year. Now, in some ways, you can think, yippee, well done for the Grimsby economy. But
yes, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? If you're a homeowner, then that's good news for you, and if you're a home developer, it's good news for you. If you're trying to get on the chain, it's difficult. I mean, it's a good sign in the sense that it shows a local economy on the up, but you've got to keep pace with that demand. You've got to keep pace with that price rise. You've got to keep putting new houses in there if the demand is showing that it's going to be there because the price increases.
But that itself is good for the local economy, isn't it? Just building houses.
Yeah.
If you build, say, Grimsby's 230 odd houses, that's going to employ about 700-800 people.
Oh yeah, I mean it's.
And then you add the infrastructure that you need to build to go with that.
Yeah, people tend to ignore the fact that construction is an industry in its own right. They just assume it's a product that's consumed, but it's not. It's a product that's produced, and the production is actually very labour intensive. Local supplies, local labour, and often local labour which can be trained up to do this sort of thing. So it's a real generator of jobs and support for local firms. Therefore, one shouldn't ignore the fact that house building is not just about more houses to house people. It's actually about giving people work in localities, because often it's something you can do on a very local basis. You can employ local people for it. It's a good thing.
Louise, how much, if I wanted to buy a house in Hull, 2-bedroom terraced house in a cheap area of Hull, what sort of prices am I looking at?
Well, there's a massive range. If you look into...
Well, I'm very poor.
You're very poor. Well, you could probably start around the 40,000 mark.
Really?
Yeah. But then going into more the better areas, or what considered the better areas, you'd be looking at 100,000. So there's a massive range. Looking at 40,000 is probably a terrace or possibly an ex-local authority house.
Same sort of prices in Grimsby?
A bit lower in certain parts of the town. In the marshes, you can pick up an unimproved 2-bedroom terrace for about 30 or less, in actual fact, in certain roads. And that's why a lot of them have gone into sitting around empty, in actual fact, because you can't make any money out of them at those sorts of levels.
Well, I think we'll have to end there, I'm afraid. Thank you both very much for joining me in discussing this issue. Thank you for the little advertising thing at the end there. I might be getting out my checkbook. Join me again next week for another hot topic. For now, good evening.